This screencast is to support this lesson on modal verbs for necessity and obligation, and it comes from Language to Go Intermediate by R. Weilman and A. Crace, published by Longman, and it's lesson 25 of the book. So first of all, it starts with some vocabulary and speaking on the rules of social or professional behaviour. And then there's an activity using do or make, followed by a reading which sets the context for the grammar focal point of modal verbs for necessity and obligation, and controlled and freer practice. So for the lead-in, we can focus on these discussion questions in exercise 1. The rules of social or professional behaviour are called etiquette. You could elicit etiquette, and then they can discuss the questions. I think questions 1 and 2 are useful. Questions 3 and 4 not necessarily for our students, but you know, you could add them in if you want to. But we don't want this to take more than 5 minutes, so depending on how much you get out of questions 1 and 2, I would consider not including questions 3 and 4. And then once you've led in and got them interested in the topic of etiquette, social behaviour, you can move on to the vocabulary exercises on do and make. This is an area that lots of students have problems with because the verb do and make is the same in lots of languages, so they just don't know which one to use. So they simply have to do the 5 sentences and fill in the gap with the correct verb do or make. So do the first one together and then get them to complete the rest. They can do it by discussing together or individually and peer checking afterwards. And once you've got some feedback at the end to check everyone has got the correct answers, they can put the expressions with do and make into 2 columns as shown in the book. And this is a nice way for them to have a clear record of the different expressions. I'd prepare a concept checking question or 2 for make a good impression, because that's a useful expression for them to know and it links in well with the reading that's coming afterwards. So before they read the text, you need to check that they know the meaning of netiquette. So this is an invented word which of course puts together 2 words, and you can ask them which 2 words you think are put together to make this word. So internet and etiquette, they've already seen etiquette earlier on in the lesson, and they might be able to guess that it's internet plus etiquette. And then ask them, once they've worked that out, what they think netiquette means. So it's how to behave on the internet, or how to write an email in our case for our reading, okay? And then they need to look back at exercise 2, so the exercise they did with do and make, and this time look at the 5 sentences and decide together if they're true or false. So do number 1 as an example. So for example, it's not important to make a good impression when you email at work. Of course, that's false. So get them to do that first one briefly as an example, and then they can talk together and discuss the other 4 sentences, saying whether they're true or false. And then we're going to come down to exercise 4, where they read the text to see if their answers about netiquette were correct. Okay, so they're going to check the answers from exercise 2 while they read the text. So here's the text. There's not really any vocabulary that needs pre-teaching. It's pretty straightforward. And any blocking vocabulary they would probably be able to guess the meaning of from its context. So they are doing exercise 4, reading the text to see if the answers from exercise 2, the statements with do or make are true or false. Okay, so again, do an example where they read the text and answer the question, and then they can do the rest on their own, reading through the text and peer checking afterwards before you get feedback, making sure you show those visual answers. Okay, so number 2, 3, 4 and 5, are they true or false? Next comes the grammar focus. So exercise 5, the verbs below are used to express obligation and necessity. And they need to look back at the text on Netiquette and find one example from the text for each of the verbs. So in this little table, you've got the verbs on the left. So these are modal verbs. Okay, they're auxiliary modal verbs. And on the right, you've got the example from the text. So the full sentence, which contains those verbs. So give them time to do that alone, and then to check together to make sure they've all got the same. And they should end up then with 6 sentences in that right-hand column, all containing the verbs on the left. Okay, so then that means we've got our example sentences for them to work from and analyse. Okay, so they can work out the meaning by doing exercise 6. So they look back at the sentences they found from the text in the table in exercise 5, and they can talk together and answer the questions in exercise 6. Okay, so these all check the meaning of the verbs. Okay, so the first one's been done. You could take that one out and get the students to do that one first of all. So number 1, it's necessary. I'm telling myself. Which sentence is it? Which sentence shows that I'm telling myself something is necessary? Good, it's the sentence with must. So they write must, and then they can do the rest. Make sure they're talking together, discussing, okay, so that they can share opinions and share knowledge and build confidence. It would be a good idea, after you've got the feedback to exercise 6, to use some concept checking questions to really make sure that they've grasped the difference between obligation and necessity. So for example, you mustn't send an email all in capitals. Is that obligation or necessity? It's obligation, isn't it? It's another way of saying you mustn't send an email all in capitals. You mustn't. You're not allowed. It's forbidden. Do you have a choice? The answer is no, isn't it? And then we've got something like, you don't have to use abbreviations. Okay, do you have a choice there? You don't have to use abbreviations. Yes, you've got a choice. You don't have to, but you can if you want to. So just make sure they've understood the heart of the concepts here. Once you're sure they've really grasped the difference in meaning, also checking things like which one's stronger, shouldn't or mustn't, things like that. Just really think about the differences. Then we can move on to form. So they need to look back at the sentences in the table here in exercise 5 and analyse the structure, the form of the sentence. Okay, so you could give them the first one, and underneath you could write, for example, gap plus gap plus gap. How do we make a sentence using these verbs on the left? I must make it plain and simple. Okay, so I, what is I? It's the subject. Good, so they could write subject in the first gap, and then plus, what's this? Okay, they could call it a modal verb if they want, or just a verb, or you could just say must, have to, should, shouldn't, etc. And then what is this? What form of the verb is this that comes after it? And they need to work out that it's the bare infinitive or the base verb or the infinitive without to. Lots of different names for the same thing. So you want them to work out the form by looking at the sentences and having a gapped sentence, and they need to discuss the form together, okay? Just give them a couple of minutes to do that as a task, and then hopefully they'll come up with subject plus modal verb plus bare infinitive, and that's what they need to know to be able to use it in a sentence. And then you want to drill some of these sentences to practice pronunciation. So focus on things like sentence stress, any linking, the contracted forms, any weak forms, okay, that the students need to know about when they're saying it in a sentence. For example, your messages should be short. Your messages should be short. Where's the stress? You have to use plain English. You have to use plain English. What happens to the to? Okay, so analyse that. Get the students to listen, repeat, drill chorally and individually, and ask them to identify different features of the phonology that are useful. Next, we've got the controlled practice. So exercise 7, complete the sentences with the most appropriate verb, okay? So they use the table that they've been working with previously, and they choose the most appropriate verb to go in the gap, okay? So there's an example that's been done, okay? I would take out have to here and get them to do that briefly together as an example. And make sure that they are clear that there may be more than one answer for each one, okay, depending on the meaning they want to convey. All right, so there are 7 sentences that they need to put a modal verb into. Pretty straightforward. Get them to peer check once they've done it, and nominate for answers, making sure that they can see all the right answers and the different possible answers, and that they're clear on how the different answers change the meaning. Now it's time for some freer practice. So I like this activity, which we've taken from the teacher's resource book for Language to Go Intermediate, and basically that you have lots of situations and they have to decide on the right thing to do using the modal verbs. Okay, so you could do the first one as an example. You receive an email attachment which you think may contain a virus. What's the right thing to do? And they need to come up with ideas using the verbs. You mustn't, you should, you shouldn't, you have to, you don't have to. They don't have to use them all, but you want them to be using a variety of verbs with the different situations, okay? So you could have a timed activity where you tell the students you want everyone to participate and say at least one sentence using one of these structures about the situation, okay? And they've got perhaps 2 minutes. Okay, so you could have that one on a slide as the example. Okay, and then on the next slide, the next situation, the next one, etc. So each student has to participate using at least one sentence with this language. Okay, and you can sit back and monitor and make a note of any errors that students are making, as well as any examples of good sentences they say using the target language. So they might say, for example, in the first one, you mustn't to open it. That's a common mistake where they put the to before the verb, and you could use that later for them to correct in your post-fluency error correction slot. I think this activity would generate more discussion and practice than the one in the students' coursebook. So yes, I would go with this one. I think they'd enjoy it. So all in all, this lesson should provide a lot of practice of the target language.